Captain Rebecca Becker Hayes stood at attention in Chief Warrant Officer Marcus Thompson's office, her flight suit crisp despite the Arizona heat that made Fort Huachuca shimmer like a mirage. The walls were covered with photos of Thompson's distinguished career, images of Apache helicopters in various combat zones, commendations and group shots with pilots who had earned his respect over 3 decades of service. "You're not ready, Hayes," Thompson said without looking up from the paperwork on his desk. His voice carried the weight of absolute authority, the kind that ended careers with a single sentence. "The Apache isn't a training aircraft. Combat missions require experience you simply don't possess." Becca felt her jaw tighten, but her expression remained neutral. She'd prepared for this conversation, rehearsed her arguments, compiled her qualifications, top of her class at flight school, perfect simulator scores, weapon system certification completed ahead of schedule. Every benchmark exceeded, every requirement met with room to spare. "Sir, with respect, my simulator hours exceed the program requirements by 40%. My tactical knowledge scores simulators." Thompson's laugh was sharp, dismissive. "You think flying a computer game prepares you for real combat? For making split-second decisions when enemy fire is tearing through your aircraft?" The office fell silent, except for the distant sound of rotors from the flight line. Through the window, Becca could see the Apache she'd dreamed of flying, a metallic predator sitting on the tarmac, its twin engines silent, rotors folded against the desert sky. Captain Derek Morrison was already walking toward it, helmet tucked, under his arm, preparing for the advanced training mission that should have been hers. "The selection committee has made its decision," Thompson continued, finally looking up. His grey eyes held no warmth, no recognition of her achievements. "You'll be reassigned to support operations, transport helicopters, medical evacuation. Important work, don't misunderstand me, but the Apache program is for combat-proven pilots. I understand the Apache isn't just another helicopter, sir. I've studied every manual, memorized every system specification, completed every preparatory course ahead of schedule." Becca's voice remained steady despite the frustration building in her chest. "What I don't understand is how I'm supposed to gain combat experience if I'm never given the opportunity to prove myself." Thompson's expression hardened. "That's exactly the kind of thinking that concerns me, Hayes. This isn't about proving yourself. This is about proven capability. The Apache represents $65 million of taxpayer investment and the lives of soldiers who depend on close air support. I won't risk either on someone who thinks this is about personal validation." The words hit like a physical blow. Becca had dedicated 4 years to reaching this moment, had outperformed her peers in every measurable category, had sacrificed everything to excel in a field where women were still fighting for acceptance. And now she was being dismissed as someone seeking personal validation rather than genuine combat readiness. "Sir, I respectfully request denied." Thompson's voice cut through her words like a blade. "The decision is final. Report to Colonel Williams in transport operations at 0800 tomorrow. That's all, Captain." Becca saluted crisply, her military bearing perfect despite the crushing disappointment. As she turned to leave, Thompson added one final comment that would echo in her mind for hours to come. "Hayes, some doors aren't meant for everyone. The sooner you accept that, the better your career will be." Outside the office, the Arizona sun felt harsh against her face. The flight line buzzed with activity, ground crews prepping aircraft, pilots conducting pre-flight checks, the controlled chaos of military aviation at its finest. But Becca felt like she was watching it all through glass, separated from the world she'd trained so hard to join. Master Sergeant Kelly Rodriguez approached from the maintenance hangar, her expression sympathetic. Rodriguez had been watching. The Apache program for 5 years had seen talented pilots come and go, had witnessed the politics and prejudices that sometimes influence decisions that should have been based purely on merit.
"Rough meeting?" Rodriguez asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "They're not ready for change," Becca replied quietly, watching Morrison climb into the Apache's cockpit. "Maybe they never will be. Or maybe they just need the
right moment to see what they're missing," Rodriguez said. "Sometimes the universe has a way of creating those moments when we least expect them." As Morrison's Apache lifted off, its distinctive rotor signature cutting through the desert air, Becca felt something crystallize inside her. Thompson was wrong about one thing. This wasn't about personal validation. It was about proving that excellence couldn't be measured by traditional metrics alone. That potential often existed in places where conventional wisdom didn't think to look. She didn't know it yet, but circumstances were already conspiring to create exactly the kind of moment Rodriguez had mentioned. In less than 6 hours, an emergency would arise that would test everything Thompson thought he knew about combat, readiness, about proven capability, and about the pilot he'd just dismissed as unworthy of the Apache program. The desert wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and the distant sound of artillery training. Somewhere in the back of her mind, Becca began to understand that rejection wasn't always the end of a story. Sometimes it was just the beginning of a different chapter altogether. The mess hall at Fort Huachuca buzzed with the usual dinner conversation. Deployment, stories, upcoming training exercises, complaints about the heat. But tonight, Becca noticed something different in the way conversation stopped when she approached, how groups of pilots suddenly found reasons to disperse when she sat down. "Don't let it get to you," said Lieutenant Jake Martinez, settling into the seat across from her. Martinez was one of the few pilots who'd consistently treated her as an equal rather than an outsider. "The rumor mill works overtime around here."
"What rumors?" Becca asked, though she suspected she already knew. "That you went over Thompson's head, that you're filing complaints about gender discrimination, that you're planning to make a big scene about being passed over." Martinez shook his head. "You know how it is.
One person makes an assumption, passes it along, and suddenly it becomes accepted fact. Becca pushed her food around her plate, appetite gone. "I haven't filed any complaints. I haven't talked to anyone outside the chain of command. I haven't done anything except accept the decision and report to my new assignment tomorrow. I know that. Rodriguez knows that. But Thompson's been talking to the other instructors, making sure everyone understands why you weren't selected. According to him, you lack the mental toughness for combat operations. Too emotional, too focused on personal achievement rather than mission success. The accusations stung because they were so fundamentally wrong. Everything Becca had done since arriving at Fort Huachuca had been focused on becoming the best possible pilot for the mission she might be asked to fly. She'd studied tactics, memorized procedures, trained harder than anyone else in her class, specifically because she understood the weight of responsibility that came with Apache operations. "There's something else," Martinez said quietly, leaning forward. "Morrison's been bragging about how Thompson specifically chose him over you. Says Thompson told him that female pilots are fine for transport and medical evacuation, but combat operations require a different kind of mindset. Says women are too risk-averse to make the split-second decisions that save lives in combat." The words felt like salt in an open wound. Becca had spent years proving she could handle high-pressure situations, had excelled in every scenario designed to test decision-making under stress. The suggestion that her gender made her inherently unsuitable for combat operations was both
insulting and demonstrably false. "Martinez, can I ask you something?" Becca kept her voice low, conscious of the other conversations around them.
In all your training with me, in all the exercises we've run together, have you ever seen me hesitate when decisions needed to be made? Never. You're one of the most decisive pilots I've worked with. Your tactical thinking is better than most of the guys who've been flying for years. Martinez paused, then added, which is probably why some of them are so eager to see you fail. That evening, Becca walked the perimeter of the base, needing space to think away from the suffocating atmosphere
of speculation and judgment.
The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, painted in shades of purple and gold by the setting sun. In the distance, she could hear the sound of night training exercises, artillery fire, helicopter rotors, the controlled violence of military preparation. She thought about her father, Master Sergeant Robert Hayes, who'd spent 26 years in the Air Force maintaining the aircraft that carried soldiers into combat zones around the world. He'd taught her that the military was supposed to be a meritocracy, where performance mattered more than background or politics. But he'd also warned her that changing institutional cultures took time, that she'd face resistance from people who equated tradition with effectiveness. The key, he told her during one of their last conversations before his retirement, is to be so undeniably good at what you do that they can't ignore you. Not good enough to get by, not good enough to meet standards, but so exceptional that denying your capabilities becomes impossible. But what happened when exceptional performance wasn't enough? What happened when the gatekeepers decided that certain doors would remain closed regardless of qualifications or achievements? Her phone buzzed with a text message from Rodriguez.
Heard about the rumors. Don't let the bastards get you down. Your time will come.
Becca smiled despite herself. Rodriguez had survived 22 years in a military that had only recently begun accepting women in combat roles. She'd faced every form of discrimination and prejudice imaginable, had fought battles that cleared the path for pilots like Becca to even have the opportunity to apply for programs like Apache training. But Rodriguez's message carried an undertone that Becca was beginning to understand. Her time would come, but it might not come through official channels or traditional advancement paths. Sometimes opportunities arose from unexpected circumstances, from moments when the normal rules didn't apply and performance became the only thing that mattered. Back in her quarters, Becca spread out the Apache technical manuals she'd been studying for months. If Thompson was right about one thing, it was that the Apache represented an incredible responsibility. Every system, every weapon, every capability had been designed to save American lives and accomplish missions that other aircraft couldn't handle. She began reviewing the emergency procedures she'd memorized, engine failure scenarios, combat damage assessments, forced landing techniques. The manual covered dozens of situations that could arise during combat operations, each requiring specific responses and split-second decision-making. As she studied, Becca found herself wondering about the convoy exercises scheduled for the next week. Intelligence reports suggested increased hostile activity in the training areas, scenarios designed to simulate real-world combat conditions. If something went wrong during those exercises, if an emergency arose that required immediate air support, who would respond? The question lingered in her mind as she prepared for bed, unaware that tomorrow would bring exactly the kind of emergency that would test everything. She thought she knew about proving herself when conventional opportunities had been denied. Outside her window, the desert night was filled with the sounds of a military base that never truly slept. Guard patrols, maintenance crews, the distant rumble of aircraft engines. Somewhere in that darkness, circumstances were already beginning to align in ways that would challenge every assumption about who was ready for combat operations and who deserved the chance to prove themselves when American lives were on the line. 3 days into her new assignment with transport operations, Becca found herself flying medical evacuation runs and supply missions that felt like punishment disguised as duty. The work was important, she understood that, but every time she saw an Apache lift off for advanced training, the sting of rejection felt fresh and sharp. Colonel Diana Williams, her new commanding officer, was professional but distant. During their initial meeting, she'd made it clear that she'd read Becca's file and understood her qualifications, but that dwelling on what might have been wouldn't serve anyone's interests. "You're an exceptional pilot, Hayes," Williams had said. "Transport operations might not be what you envisioned, but the soldiers you'll be supporting depend on exceptional pilots just as much as any combat unit." The words were meant to be encouraging, but they felt hollow. Becca had trained for combat operations, had prepared for the challenges that came with close air support and tactical missions. Flying wounded soldiers to medical facilities was crucial work, but it wasn't the work she'd dedicated years to preparing for. On Thursday morning, everything changed in the most brutal way possible. Becca was reviewing flight plans in the operations
center when Captain Morrison burst through the door, his face flushed with anger and something that looked like panic.
Behind him came Master Sergeant Rodriguez, her expression grim in a way that immediately put everyone in the room on alert. "Where's Colonel Williams?" Morrison demanded, his voice carrying an edge that suggested barely controlled fury. "In her
office?" Becca replied. "What's wrong?" Morrison ignored her, storming toward Williams's office with Rodriguez following. But their conversation was loud enough to carry through the thin walls, and what Becca heard made her blood run cold.
"The maintenance report was falsified," Rodriguez was saying. "I've been going through the records, cross-checking everything. Someone signed off on inspections that were never completed, approved repairs that were never made." Williams' voice was sharp with concern. "Which aircraft?" "3 of the Apaches in the advanced training program, including the one Morrison's been flying. The hydraulic systems show signs of wear that should have grounded them weeks ago. The avionics packages have software glitches that weren't reported. Someone's been covering up maintenance issues to keep the training schedules on track." Morrison's voice rose to a near shout. "You're saying I've been flying aircraft that weren't airworthy? That Thompson knew about this?" "I'm saying someone made decisions that prioritized training schedules over flight safety," Rodriguez replied carefully. "Whether Thompson knew the extent of the problems or was just getting selective reports, I can't say yet." The implications hit Becca like a physical blow. If the Apache maintenance had been compromised, if safety inspections had been falsified, then every pilot in the program had been placed at risk. But more than that, if the investigation revealed systematic problems with the Apache program, the entire training schedule would be suspended until every aircraft could be thoroughly inspected and certified. Williams emerged from her office, her face showing the strain of a commander facing a crisis that could have catastrophic implications. "Rodriguez, I want every Apache grounded immediately. No exceptions. Morrison, you're to report to the base commander for debriefing. Hayes." She paused, looking at Becca, with an expression that suggested she was calculating possibilities and risks. "Hayes, you're current on Apache systems, correct?" "Yes, ma'am. Fully certified on all systems except for solo flight authorization." "Good. I want you to work with Rodriguez on the inspection protocols. If we're going to get these aircraft back in the air, we need pilots who understand the systems well enough to verify that repairs are actually being completed." It was the first time in weeks that Becca felt like her qualifications were being recognized rather than dismissed. But the satisfaction was overshadowed by the growing realization that Thompson's Apache program was facing a crisis that could destroy careers and potentially compromise national security if the problems extended. Beyond Fort Huachuca, over the next 6 hours, the scope of the maintenance scandal became clear. Rodriguez's investigation revealed that Chief Warrant Officer Thompson had been under enormous pressure to maintain training schedules despite budget cuts and personnel shortages. Rather than reduce the number of pilots in training, someone had made the decision to defer maintenance and falsify inspection reports. "It's worse than I thought," Rodriguez told Becker as they worked through the aircraft records. The pressure to keep pilots rotating through the program led to shortcuts that compromised safety. Thompson might not have ordered the falsification directly, but he created an environment where his subordinates felt they had to choose between honest reporting and meeting his expectations. How many pilots have been flying compromised aircraft? All of them. Every pilot who's been through the program in the last 8 months has been flying aircraft that weren't properly maintained. Rodriguez shook her head. Morrison's lucky he didn't have a catastrophic failure during his solo flights. Any one of these Apaches could have gone down without warning. The revelation put Thompson's rejection of Becker in an entirely new light. He'd claimed she wasn't ready for the responsibility of Apache operations, but he'd been allowing qualified pilots to fly aircraft that posed deadly risks due to deferred maintenance and falsified inspections. His concerns about combat readiness seemed hypocritical when measured against his willingness to compromise basic flight safety. That evening, Becker sat in her quarters, staring at the Apache manuals that had been her constant companions for months. The aircraft she'd dreamed of flying were now grounded, their problems so extensive that it would take weeks to complete proper inspections and repairs. The program that had rejected her was suspended indefinitely, its reputation damaged by the very leadership that had questioned her qualifications. But more than vindication, Becker felt a growing sense of purpose. Rodriguez had shown her something that Thompson apparently hadn't understood, that true professionalism meant prioritizing safety and honesty over politics and appearance. If she ever got the chance to fly Apaches, she'd do it the right way, with the kind of integrity that put mission success and pilot safety above personal advancement or organizational pressure. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed Rodriguez's number. "Hayes, you need to get to the operations center immediately. We've got an emergency developing, and every qualified pilot is going to be needed." "What kind of emergency?" "The kind that's going to test everything we think we know about who's really ready for combat operations. Get down here now." As Becker grabbed her flight suit and headed for the door, she had no idea that the next few hours would vindicate every hour she'd spent preparing for opportunities that conventional channels had denied her. Sometimes the universe created moments when politics and prejudice became irrelevant, when only performance mattered, and when the pilots who were truly ready got their chance to prove it, regardless of who had previously questioned their qualifications. The operations center was in chaos when Becker arrived, filled with personnel coordinating what was obviously a major emergency response. Radio transmissions crackled with urgent updates, while officers huddled around tactical displays showing the developing situation. Colonel Williams spotted her immediately. "Hayes, over here! We've got a situation that's about to test everyone's capabilities." The tactical display showed a convoy of military vehicles stopped in a narrow canyon approximately 15 miles northeast of the base. Red indicators marked hostile positions on the high ground surrounding the convoy, while medical symbols indicated wounded personnel requiring immediate evacuation. "Intelligence reports suggest this is a planned ambush," Williams explained. "The convoy was carrying classified equipment for field testing when they were hit by coordinated small arms and RPG fire. They're pinned down with limited ammunition and 2 critically wounded soldiers who need medical attention within the hour to survive." Major Lisa Carter, the operations officer, joined the briefing. "Ground-based rescue is impossible given the terrain and enemy positions. We need air support to suppress the hostile fire and evacuate the wounded, but here's the problem. All our Apaches are grounded pending maintenance inspection." Becca felt her pulse quicken as she began to understand why she'd been summoned. What about the other helicopters? Transport aircraft? Transport helicopters can't operate in that environment, Carter replied. The canyon is too narrow for safe approach with enemy positions commanding the high ground. Tactical evacuation aircraft don't have the defensive capabilities to survive in a hostile fire zone. We need an Apache for this mission, something with the firepower to neutralize the enemy positions and the maneuverability to extract personnel from a confined landing zone. Williams turned to face Becca directly. Hayes, Rodriguez tells me you're fully certified on Apache systems. Is that accurate? Yes, ma'am. All systems except solo flight authorization, and your simulator hours over 300 hours, including combat scenarios and emergency procedures. Carter looked skeptical. Simulator hours aren't the same as actual flight experience. This mission would challenge even experienced Apache pilots, which is why it's a problem that all our experienced Apache pilots have been flying aircraft with compromised maintenance, Rodriguez interjected as she joined the group. We've got one Apache that was scheduled for major maintenance and hasn't been flying for the past month. I've spent the last 4 hours going through every system, every component, every inspection record. It's fully operational and ready for immediate deployment. The implications hung in the air like smoke. They had one operational Apache helicopter, a critical mission that required Apache capabilities, and a pilot who was technically qualified but had never flown solo combat operations. The alternative was watching American soldiers die while waiting for properly qualified pilots to arrive from other bases, a delay that could prove fatal for the wounded personnel. Williams stared at the tactical display for a long moment, weighing options that all carried enormous risks and potentially devastating consequences. Hayes, I need you to be completely honest about your capabilities. This isn't a training exercise or a routine mission. People will die if you're not ready for this level of responsibility. Ma'am, I've spent 18 months preparing for exactly this kind of mission. I know every system on that aircraft, every tactical procedure, every emergency protocol. I've run dozens of similar scenarios in simulation, including combat situations with wounded personnel and hostile fire. Simulation isn't reality, Carter interjected. No, it's not, Becca agreed. But it's the best preparation available when reality isn't an option. Every pilot starts with their first real mission. The question is whether that first mission comes during training exercises or during emergencies when people are depending on you to perform. Rodriguez stepped forward. Colonel, I've worked with Hayes for months. I've watched her approach to aircraft systems, her attention to detail, her understanding of complex procedures. She's more thoroughly prepared than most pilots who've been flying Apaches for years. Williams studied Becca's face, looking for any sign of doubt or uncertainty that would suggest she wasn't ready for the responsibility being placed on her shoulders. Hayes, if I authorize this mission, you'll be flying solo into a combat zone with no backup, no instructor, no safety net. The lives of those soldiers will depend entirely on your skill and judgment. I understand, ma'am, and I'm ready. The decision came down to mathematics and mortality. They had wounded soldiers who would die without immediate evacuation, enemy positions that could only be neutralized by Apache firepower, and one pilot who was technically qualified but untested in actual combat. The alternatives were either accepting the loss of American lives or trusting that training and preparation could substitute for experience when lives were on the line. Williams made the call that would define Becca's career and potentially save or cost the lives of the soldiers trapped in the canyon. Hayes, you're authorized for immediate deployment. Rodriguez, I want that Apache fully prepped and ready for combat operations. Carter, coordinate with the convoy commander and provide Hayes with real-time intelligence updates. As Becca headed toward the flight line, Her mind was already running through the mission parameters and tactical considerations. The canyon terrain would limit her approach options, the enemy positions commanded the high ground, and the wounded soldiers needed extraction under fire, exactly the kind of complex scenario she'd trained for, but never executed under actual combat conditions. Rodriguez fell into step beside her. "Hayes, listen to me. You've got the technical knowledge and the tactical understanding to succeed. The only thing you lack is the confidence that comes from experience. Trust your training, trust your instincts, and remember that those soldiers are counting on you to do what you've been preparing for your entire career." Rodriguez, what if Thompson was right? What if I'm not ready for this level of responsibility? Thompson was wrong about a lot of things, starting with his maintenance standards and ending with his assessment of your capabilities. You're about to prove that qualification isn't just about experience. It's about preparation, dedication, and the courage to perform when it matters most. As they approached the Apache, Becca felt the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. This wasn't just about proving herself or vindicating her qualifications. American soldiers were trapped in a canyon, taking fire from enemy positions, bleeding from wounds that could prove fatal without immediate medical attention. The Apache sat on the tarmac like a mechanical predator, its systems armed and ready for the kind of mission it had been designed to accomplish. In a few minutes, Becca would climb into the cockpit and face the ultimate test of everything she'd learned about flying, about combat operations, and about the responsibility that came with piloting one of the most sophisticated weapons platforms in the American military. But first, she had to silence the voice in her head that sounded suspiciously like Thompson, questioning whether she was truly ready for what lay ahead. The Apache's engines spun up with the distinctive whine that announced serious business. Becca ran through her pre-flight checklist with mechanical precision, every switch position verified, every system parameter checked against specifications she'd memorized months ago. But this time, the checklist items carried different weight, each one representing a potential difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Apache 1-7, you are cleared for immediate departure to grid reference 347891, came the voice from the control tower. Weather is clear, winds from the southwest at 8 knots. You have priority clearance through all airspaces. Control, Apache 1-7 acknowledges, departing for combat operations. The words felt strange in her mouth, her first transmission, as a pilot heading into actual combat rather than training exercises. As the Apache lifted off, Becca could see personnel gathered around the operations center, watching her departure with expressions that mixed hope with concern. The flight to the canyon took 12 minutes, during which Becca received continuous updates from the convoy commander about the tactical situation. 3 enemy positions had been identified on the ridgeline, with coordinated fire preventing any attempt to evacuate the wounded soldiers. Small arms fire had intensified over the past hour, suggesting the enemy was either receiving reinforcements or becoming increasingly desperate to complete their ambush before help arrived. Apache 1-7, this is Groundhog 6, came the strained voice of the convoy commander. We have 2 urgent surgical cases and approximately 30 minutes of ammunition remaining. Enemy positions are dug in on the north ridge with overlapping fields of fire. Previous attempts to move have resulted in increased casualties. Becca's tactical display began painting the battlefield as she approached the engagement zone. Thermal sensors identified muzzle flashes from the enemy positions, while her navigation system calculated approach vectors that would allow her to engage the hostile forces while minimizing exposure to ground fire. What she saw when she crested the ridge leading to the canyon confirmed the gravity of the situation. The convoy was trapped in a narrow passage between rock walls that rose nearly vertical on both sides. Enemy positions commanded every angle of approach, creating a kill zone that made ground-based rescue virtually impossible. But Becker's training allowed her to see something that the ground forces couldn't, a tactical opportunity that would require precise flying and perfect weapons employment, but could neutralize the enemy positions while creating a safe corridor for medical evacuation. Groundhog 6, Apache 1. 7 has eyes on your position. I am going to make 3 attack runs to eliminate the enemy positions, then extract your wounded personnel. Keep your heads down and be ready to mark your casualties with smoke when I call for it. The first attack run required her to fly directly into the canyon at high speed, using the terrain to mask her approach until she could engage the northernmost enemy position. The 30mm chain gun spoke with authority, high explosive rounds finding their target with precision that demonstrated complete mastery of the Apache's weapons systems. The second position required a different approach, coming in from the east at an angle that allowed her to engage while keeping the Apache in motion to avoid return fire. 2 Hellfire missiles launched in quick succession, their explosive impact eliminating the threat and sending debris cascading down the canyon walls. The third position was the most challenging, dug in behind rocks that provided natural cover, and positioned to engage her aircraft during the approach. Becker solved the problem by using the canyon walls themselves, flying a precise course that kept her in the enemy's blind spot until she could engage with the chain gun at point-blank range. The entire engagement lasted 97 seconds, from first shot to last target neutralized, but those 97 seconds contained flying and weapons employment that would be analyzed by tactical experts for years to come. The precision, innovation, and flawless execution under extreme pressure represented exactly what Apache operations were supposed to achieve when exceptional pilots were given the opportunity to prove themselves. Groundhog 6, all enemy positions. Neutralized, prepare for medical evacuation, mark your casualties with smoke and clear a landing zone. Landing in the canyon required the kind of precision flying that separated adequate pilots from exceptional ones. The available space was barely wider than the Apache's rotor diameter, surrounded by obstacles that left no margin for error. Becker brought the aircraft down with delicate control inputs that kept the rotors clear by inches while maintaining perfect stability for the medical evacuation. The wounded soldiers were loaded aboard with efficiency that reflected their urgent medical needs. One had sustained multiple gunshot wounds and was showing signs of shock, while the other had shrapnel injuries that required immediate surgical intervention. Both were conscious enough to express their gratitude to the pilot who had risked her life to extract them from what had seemed like certain death. Apache 1-7 to base operations, Becker transmitted as she lifted off from the canyon floor. 2 wounded personnel extracted and en route for medical treatment. All enemy positions neutralized. Groundhog 6 is secure and ready for ground extraction. The return flight took on the quality of a victory lap, though Becker maintained the professional composure that had carried her through the entire engagement. Word of what had happened in the canyon was already spreading through military communication networks transmitted by observers who struggled to find adequate words to describe what they had witnessed. Ground forces were describing the engagement as the most precise aerial support they'd ever received. Officers monitoring the mission had watched Becker execute maneuvers that textbooks said were impossible, using tactics that demonstrated not just technical skill, but innovative thinking under extreme pressure. When Becker's Apache touched down at Fort Huachuca, she found herself facing a reception that went far beyond what she'd expected. Colonel Williams stood waiting with a group of officers and personnel who had gathered to witness the return of a pilot who had just redefined their understanding of what was possible in an Apache cockpit. But the true measure of her achievement came in the form of a message that arrived as she completed her post-flight procedures. The wounded soldiers had reached the medical facility in time for successful treatment. Both were expected to make full recoveries thanks to the quick action of a pilot who had proven herself ready for combat operations in the most definitive way possible. As Becca climbed out of the Apache, she realized that everything had changed in the space of a single mission. The pilot, who had been dismissed as unready for combat operations, had just completed one of the most successful rescue missions in Fort Huachuca's history, proving that qualification wasn't just about experience, it was about preparation, courage, and the ability to perform when lives depended on excellence. Within hours of Becca's return, Fort Huachuca was buzzing with activity that went far beyond typical post-mission debriefing. Colonel Williams had initiated a formal investigation into the maintenance practices that had grounded the Apache fleet, and the preliminary findings were creating shockwaves that reached the highest levels of Army Aviation Command. Becca found herself in the unusual position of being both a hero and a key witness in a scandal that threatened to destroy careers and reshape how the Apache program operated. The success of her mission had highlighted the contrast between her readiness for combat operations and the systematic failures that had endangered every pilot in the program. "Hayes, I need you to walk me through exactly what you observed about the Apache's performance during your mission," said Colonel James Patterson, the investigating officer who had arrived from Fort Rucker that morning. "Any anomalies, any systems that didn't respond as expected, any indication that maintenance issues affected your aircraft's performance?" "Sir, the aircraft performed flawlessly. Every system functioned exactly as designed. Every response was immediate and precise. If anything, the Apache's performance exceeded the specifications I'd studied." Becca paused, then added, "Which makes the maintenance falsifications even more concerning. If proper maintenance produces that level of performance, what were the
other aircraft actually capable of?" Patterson's expression was grim. "That's exactly what we're trying to determine."
Rodriguez has provided us with documentation showing that 3 Apache helicopters had maintenance issues that should have grounded them immediately, but the inspection reports show all systems as fully operational. The investigation was revealing a pattern of systematic deception that went far beyond simple maintenance shortcuts. Someone had been falsifying inspection reports, approving repairs that were never completed, and signing off on aircraft that posed serious safety risks to their pilots. The pressure to maintain training schedules had created an environment where honest reporting was sacrificed for operational appearance. Master Sergeant Rodriguez had become the investigation's star witness, her meticulous record-keeping providing evidence of the discrepancies between actual maintenance and reported maintenance. "I started noticing problems 3 months ago," she explained to the investigating team. "Equipment that should have been replaced was still in service. Repairs that were supposedly completed showed no evidence of actual work. When I tried to raise concerns, I was told that training schedules took priority over maintenance perfection. The implications were staggering. If the maintenance falsifications had continued, it was only a matter of time before a catastrophic failure occurred during flight operations. Pilots could have been killed by aircraft that had been certified as airworthy but were actually flying with potentially fatal mechanical problems." "The most disturbing aspect," Patterson continued, "is that Chief Warrant Officer Thompson was receiving reports showing all aircraft as fully operational, while the actual maintenance records tell a completely different story. Either he was aware of the falsifications and chose to ignore them, or his subordinates were deliberately deceiving him about the condition of aircraft under his command. Thompson's role in the scandal was becoming increasingly difficult to defend. As the Apache program commander, he was responsible for ensuring that all aircraft met safety standards before being cleared for flight operations. Either he had failed in that fundamental responsibility, or he had knowingly allowed unsafe aircraft to continue flying to maintain his training schedules. The contrast between Thompson's treatment of Becca and his handling of maintenance issues was becoming a central theme in the investigation. He had questioned her readiness for combat operations while allowing qualified pilots to fly aircraft with compromised safety systems. His concerns about risk management seemed hypocritical when measured against his willingness to accept maintenance shortcuts that put pilots' lives in danger. "Hayes," Patterson said during one of their interviews, "Thompson's assessment of your qualifications is part of this investigation. His written evaluation states that you lacked the experience necessary for safe Apache operations. But your mission performance suggests otherwise. How do you reconcile those contradictory assessments?" "Sir, I think Thompson confused experience with capability. I may not have had combat experience, but I had the training, knowledge, and preparation necessary to succeed when given the opportunity. The mission proved that proper preparation could substitute for experience when it mattered most, and yet he denied you that opportunity while allowing less qualified pilots to fly aircraft with maintenance problems." "That's correct, sir. The irony is that my lack of experience was considered a disqualifying risk, while actual mechanical failures were considered acceptable operational risks." The investigation was also revealing the broader pressures that had contributed to the maintenance
scandal.
Budget cuts, personnel shortages, and demands for increased training throughput had created an environment where commanders felt pressured to compromise safety standards to meet operational requirements. "The fundamental problem," Rodriguez explained, during her testimony, was that Thompson treated maintenance as an obstacle to training rather than a prerequisite for safe operations. When budget restrictions limited our ability to complete proper inspections, the response wasn't to reduce the training schedule, it was to find ways around the maintenance requirements. 3 days into the investigation, a bombshell revelation emerged that changed everything. Captain Morrison, the pilot who had been selected for the Apache program over Becker, admitted under questioning that he had been aware of maintenance problems with his assigned aircraft, but had been instructed by Thompson to continue flying unless there was an immediate safety concern. "Thompson told me that maintenance reports were often overly cautious," Morrison testified. He said that experienced pilots knew how to evaluate actual risk versus bureaucratic safety margins. He made it clear that raising maintenance concerns could be seen as a lack of confidence in my abilities as a pilot. The statement revealed a culture of intimidation that had prevented pilots from reporting legitimate safety concerns for fear of being labeled as inadequate or overly cautious. Thompson had created an environment where questioning aircraft safety was treated as a personal failing rather than a professional responsibility. But the most damaging revelation came when investigators discovered a series of emails between Thompson and his superior officers discussing the pressure to maintain training schedules despite maintenance challenges. In one particularly damning message, Thompson had written, "We can't let maintenance perfectionists slow down our pilot production. The Army needs Apache pilots more than it needs theoretical safety margins." The investigation was also uncovering evidence that Thompson's assessment of Becker's qualifications had been influenced by factors beyond her flying abilities. Several witnesses testified that Thompson had expressed concerns about integrating female pilots into combat units, questioning whether women could handle the psychological pressure of life-and-death decision-making. Thompson specifically told me that female pilots were fine for support roles, but that combat operations required a different mindset, testified Major David Brooks, one of Thompson's assistant instructors. He said women were too risk-averse to make the aggressive decisions that saved lives in combat situations. The irony was devastating. Thompson had dismissed Becker as too risk-averse for combat operations while simultaneously instructing his male pilots to accept maintenance risks that could have resulted in catastrophic aircraft failures. His gender-based assumptions about pilot capabilities had blinded him to the actual risks he was creating through his maintenance policies. As word of the investigation spread through Fort Huachuca, Becker found herself in an unexpected position. The pilot who had been rejected as unqualified was now being cited as an example of proper preparation and professional standards. Her mission success had become a benchmark against which the program's failures were being measured. "The contrast is striking," Colonel Williams observed, during one of the investigation briefings. Hayes spent months preparing for opportunities she wasn't given, while other pilots were flying aircraft that weren't properly maintained. She exceeded standards that weren't being enforced for the pilots who were supposedly more qualified. Lieutenant Martinez approached Becker after one of the investigation sessions, his expression showing a mixture of admiration and regret. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "I knew Thompson's assessment of your capabilities was wrong, but I didn't speak up when it mattered. I was more concerned about protecting my own position than supporting what was right." "You don't owe me anything, Jake. The system failed all of us, the pilots who were flying unsafe aircraft, the commanders who were getting false information, and the soldiers who were depending on equipment that wasn't properly maintained." But Becker's gracious response couldn't hide the fact that Martinez's admission reflected a broader pattern of silence that had enabled Thompson's failures to continue unchecked. Fear of retaliation, concerns about career advancement, and institutional pressure to avoid challenging authority had created an environment where problems festered until they became crises. The investigation was entering its final phase, and the preliminary findings were already clear. Thompson's Apache program had failed at multiple levels: compromised maintenance standards, falsified inspection reports, gender-based discrimination in pilot selection, and a culture of intimidation that prevented proper safety reporting. But perhaps the most significant finding was that Becker's mission had proven the possibility of a different approach. Proper preparation, honest assessment of capabilities, and adherence to actual safety standards could produce results that exceeded anything Thompson's compromise program had achieved. As investigators prepared their final report, one question remained. What consequences would Thompson face for the systematic failures that had endangered pilots' lives and compromised the Apache program's integrity? The answer would determine whether the military was truly committed to the meritocracy it claimed to represent, or whether institutional politics would once again protect those who had failed in their fundamental responsibilities. The formal hearing was scheduled for 0900 hours in the base conference room, with General Patricia Hammond presiding via video conference from Army Aviation Command headquarters. The sterile fluorescent lighting cast harsh shadows across the faces of everyone present: investigators, witnesses, and the man whose career hung in the balance. Chief Warrant Officer Marcus Thompson sat at the conference table, his uniform impeccable despite the circumstances, his weathered face showing the strain of a week spent watching his professional reputation systematically dismantled by evidence he couldn't refute. Beside him sat his military lawyer, Colonel Sandra Reeves, who had been reviewing a stack of documents that painted an increasingly damning picture of negligence and discrimination. This hearing will examine the maintenance irregularities in the Apache training program and the decision-making processes that led to those irregularities, General Hammond announced from the main display screen. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent 30 years dealing with military aviation crises and had little patience for excuses or deflection. Becker sat in the witness section, wearing her dress uniform and trying to maintain the professional composure that had carried her through the past week of testimony and investigation. Around the room sat the other pilots, maintenance personnel, and officers whose testimonies had revealed the scope of Thompson's failures. Colonel Patterson, the investigating officer, began with a summary that pulled no punches. The evidence shows a pattern of systematic maintenance falsification that endangered the lives of every pilot in the Apache program. Chief Warrant Officer Thompson either knew about these falsifications and chose to ignore them, or failed in his fundamental duty to ensure aircraft safety. Additionally, Patterson continued, the evidence suggests that pilot selection decisions were influenced by gender-based prejudices that violated military equal opportunity policies and resulted in the rejection of qualified personnel, while less qualified candidates were accepted into the program. Thompson's lawyer immediately objected. General Hammond, my client's pilot selection decisions were based on legitimate concerns about combat readiness and experience levels. The suggestion that gender bias influenced those decisions is unsupported by the evidence. Colonel Reeves, General Hammond replied, "We have testimony from multiple witnesses that Chief Warrant Officer Thompson expressed explicit concerns about female pilots' ability to handle combat operations. We have documented evidence that Captain Hayes exceeded all qualification standards while being denied program entry. Please explain how those facts don't suggest gender bias." Thompson leaned forward, his composure finally cracking. "General, with respect, Hayes had no combat experience. The Apache isn't a training aircraft. It's a weapons platform that requires proven performance under fire. I made decisions based on legitimate operational concerns, not personal prejudices." "Mr. Thompson," General Hammond's voice was ice cold, "Captain Hayes just completed one of the most successful rescue missions in this base's history, using the very aircraft you claimed she wasn't qualified to fly. Meanwhile, you allowed pilots with inferior qualifications to fly aircraft with maintenance problems that could have killed them. Please reconcile those contradictory assessments." The room fell silent, except for the hum of the air conditioning system. Thompson stared at the table, his face showing the recognition that his defense was crumbling under the weight of evidence he couldn't explain away. Master Sergeant Rodriguez was called to testify about the maintenance irregularities. Her presentation was methodical and devastating, walking through months of falsified inspection reports, deferred maintenance and safety violations that had been covered up to maintain training schedules. The hydraulic systems on 3 aircraft showed clear signs of wear that required immediate replacement, Rodriguez testified. The inspection reports showed all systems as operational, but the actual maintenance logs indicated no hydraulic work had been completed for 6 months. "Sergeant Rodriguez," General Hammond asked, "in your professional opinion, what would have happened if those aircraft had continued flying with compromised hydraulic systems?" "General, catastrophic failure was inevitable. The only question was whether it would happen during training or during combat operations. Either way, pilots would have died from mechanical failures that were completely preventable." When Thompson was called to explain the maintenance irregularities, his responses were
evasive and contradictory.
He claimed to have relied on subordinates' reports while simultaneously insisting that he maintained direct oversight of all maintenance operations. He couldn't explain how widespread falsifications had occurred without his knowledge, nor could he justify his decision to prioritize training schedules over safety requirements. "Mr. Thompson," General Hammond pressed, "you've testified that you trusted your maintenance personnel to provide accurate reports. But when Sergeant Rodriguez attempted to raise concerns about these very issues, what was your response?" Thompson's lawyer whispered something in his ear before he answered. "General, I may have been overly focused on maintaining operational tempo. In hindsight, I should have given more attention to Sergeant Rodriguez's concerns." "Overly focused," General Hammond repeated. "Mr. Thompson, you created an environment where honest safety reporting was discouraged while unsafe aircraft continued flying. That's not being overly focused. That's negligence that could have resulted in the deaths of American service members." The most damaging testimony came from Captain Morrison, who described the culture of intimidation that had prevented pilots from reporting safety concerns. Thompson made it clear that questioning aircraft safety was seen as a lack of confidence. He told us that experienced pilots should be able to handle minor mechanical issues without making a big deal about them. "Captain Morrison," Patterson asked, "did you believe the aircraft you were flying were safe for combat operations?" Morrison hesitated, glancing at Thompson before answering. "Sir, I had concerns about some of the systems, but I was told those concerns were normal and that raising them would reflect poorly on my evaluation as a pilot." General Hammond's expression showed disgust that was barely contained. So pilots were flying aircraft they knew were unsafe because they were afraid of negative performance evaluations? "Mr. Thompson, Do you understand how fundamentally that contradicts everything military aviation is supposed to represent? When Becca was called to testify, her composure and professionalism stood in stark contrast to the evasiveness and defensiveness that had characterized Thompson's responses. She answered questions directly, acknowledged the complexities of pilot selection decisions, but also documented the double standards that had influenced her rejection from the program. "Captain Hayes," General Hammond asked, "in your opinion, were the qualification standards for the Apache program applied consistently to all candidates?" "No, General. I exceeded the published standards in every measurable category, but was rejected for lacking combat experience. Meanwhile, other candidates with lower scores and fewer qualifications were accepted based on assumptions about their potential rather than demonstrated performance." "And how do you assess your readiness for combat operations after completing your recent mission?" "General, the mission proved that proper preparation can substitute for experience when training is thorough and standards are maintained. But the key factor was flying an aircraft that was properly maintained and met actual safety requirements rather than falsified inspection reports." The hearing's climax came when General Hammond addressed Thompson directly about his assessment of Becca's qualifications. "Mr. Thompson, you rejected Captain Hayes for lacking the experience necessary for safe Apache operations, but your program was simultaneously allowing pilots to fly aircraft with maintenance problems that posed far greater safety risks than any lack of experience.
How do you reconcile that contradiction?" Thompson's response was barely audible. "General, I made mistakes in judgment that I deeply regret." "Mr. Thompson, these weren't mistakes in judgment. They were systematic failures that endangered lives."
While perpetuating discrimination that has no place in the United States military, your actions compromised both safety and equal opportunity in ways that undermine everything we're supposed to stand for. The formal verdict would come later, but everyone in the room understood that Thompson's career was over. The evidence was overwhelming, his defense was non-existent, and the contrast between his failures and Becca's success made any attempt at justification seem hollow and self-serving. As the hearing adjourned, Becca caught Thompson's eye across the room. For a moment, she saw not the arrogant commander who had dismissed her capabilities, but a career military officer whose prejudices and poor judgment had destroyed everything he'd worked to build. There was no satisfaction in his downfall, only the recognition that institutional change often required individual accountability, and that progress sometimes came at the cost of careers that had been built on foundations that couldn't withstand honest scrutiny. 6 weeks after the hearing, Fort Huachuca looked different to Becca in ways that went far beyond the physical changes. New safety protocols were in place, maintenance procedures had been completely overhauled, and the Apache program was being rebuilt from the ground up with standards that prioritized actual performance over assumptions and prejudices. Chief Warrant. Officer Marcus Thompson had been relieved of command and was facing court-martial proceedings for negligence and falsification of official documents. His career was over, his reputation destroyed by evidence of systematic failures that had endangered lives and perpetuated discrimination. The man who had questioned Becca's qualifications was now a cautionary tale about what happened when personal biases overrode professional judgment. "Hayes, my office," Colonel Williams called, as Becca finished her morning briefing with the new Apache program staff. Williams had been promoted to overall command of helicopter operations at Fort Huachuca, with specific responsibility for implementing the reforms recommended by General Hammond's investigation. The office that had once belonged to Thompson was now Williams's command center, its walls covered with new photographs showing diverse groups of pilots and maintenance personnel. The change was symbolic of broader transformations that were reshaping military aviation culture throughout Army Aviation Command. "I've got news that I think you'll find interesting," Williams said, settling behind her desk with a smile that suggested the news was more than merely interesting. General Hammond has personally recommended you for immediate promotion to major and assignment as the new Apache program training officer. Becca felt her breath catch. The position Thompson had once held, the program that had rejected her, was now being offered to her with the backing of the Army's highest aviation command.
"Ma'am, I'm honored by the recommendation, but I'm not sure I have the experience to—" "Stop right there," Williams interrupted. "Hayes, you've already proven you have exactly the kind of experience we need, not the traditional experience that comes
from years of routine operations, but the kind that comes from exceptional preparation, innovative thinking, and the courage to perform when everything is on the line." The offer represented vindication beyond anything Becca had imagined possible 6 months earlier. The program that had dismissed her as unqualified was now being placed under her command, with a mandate to rebuild it according to standards that prioritized actual capability over conventional assumptions. "There's more," Williams continued. "General Hammond wants you to develop new training protocols that will be implemented throughout Army Aviation Command. Your mission performance has become the standard against which other programs will be measured. You're not just getting an opportunity to prove yourself, you're being asked to help redefine what proof looks like." Over the following days, Becca began to understand the scope of the changes that were being implemented across military aviation. Her rescue mission had become a case study in proper preparation and execution, analyzed by tactical experts and used to develop new training methodologies that emphasize substance over appearance. The new Apache program under her leadership would be different in fundamental ways. Pilot selection would be based on demonstrated competence rather than assumptions about potential. Maintenance standards would be enforced without exception. Safety reporting would be encouraged rather than discouraged. The culture of intimidation that had characterized Thompson's command would be replaced by professional standards that valued honesty and competence above conformity and politics. Master Sergeant Rodriguez was promoted to Chief of Maintenance for the entire helicopter program, her meticulous record-keeping and unwavering integrity having been recognized as exactly the kind of professionalism the military needed to prevent future scandals. "You know what I'm most proud of?" Rodriguez told Becca during one of their planning sessions for the rebuild program. "We proved that doing things the right way produces better results than cutting corners and covering up problems. Your mission succeeded because we had proper maintenance, honest evaluation, and genuine preparation rather than falsified reports and prejudiced assumptions." The first class of new Apache pilots under Becca's command included 3 female pilots, 2 of whom had been previously rejected by other programs for reasons that had more to do with bias than qualifications. Lieutenant Jennifer Walsh and Captain Maria Santos brought the same level of preparation and dedication that Becca had demonstrated, proving that excellence wasn't limited by gender when opportunities were distributed fairly. "Ma'am, Lieutenant," Walsh said during one of their training sessions, "I heard about what you went through to get here. It gives us hope that merit actually can triumph over prejudice when the system works the way it's supposed to. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Captain Morrison, the pilot who had been selected over Becca for the original Apache program, requested a private meeting 6 months after Thompson's removal. "Hayes," he said, his expression showing genuine remorse, "I owe you an apology that goes beyond anything I can adequately express. I knew Thompson's assessment of your qualifications was wrong, but I was more concerned about protecting my own position than standing up for what was right. Morrison, we were all products of a system that prioritized the wrong things. The important thing is that we learned from those mistakes and built something better. That's generous, but it doesn't excuse my silence when I should have spoken up. You were more qualified than I was, and I knew it. My acceptance into the program while you were rejected was based on factors that had nothing to do with our relative capabilities." Morrison's admission reflected a broader reckoning that was taking place throughout military aviation. Officers and pilots who had benefited from or enabled discriminatory practices were being forced to confront the ways their silence had perpetuated systemic problems that undermined the meritocracy the military claimed to represent. A year later, Becca stood on the flight line at Fort Huachuca, watching a new class of Apache pilots complete their final training exercises. The program she now commanded had become a model for other installations, with safety records and performance, standards that exceeded anything achieved under previous leadership. The Apache helicopters lined up on the tarmac represented more than just military hardware. They symbolized an organization's ability to recognize and correct its failures, to embrace change when traditional methods proved inadequate, and to trust that excellence could emerge from sources that conventional wisdom might overlook. General Hammond had visited the previous month to observe the program's progress, and her assessment had been unequivocal. This is what military aviation should look like when merit is the only qualification that matters and safety is never compromised for convenience. But the transformation extended beyond just the Apache program. Becca's story had become part of military culture, cited in leadership courses and equal opportunity training as an example of what happened when institutional barriers were removed and individuals were evaluated based on their actual capabilities rather than assumptions about their limitations. As the sun set over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple, Becca reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The rejection that had seemed like the end of her dreams had become the beginning of something far more significant, proof that sometimes the greatest victories came not from achieving personal goals, but from changing systems that had prevented others from achieving theirs. The Apache program that had once dismissed her as unqualified was now under her command, rebuilt according to standards that ensured future pilots would be evaluated fairly and trained safely. The culture that had prioritized prejudice over performance had been replaced by one that valued competence above all else. It wasn't the ending she had originally envisioned, but it was far better than anything she had dared to hope for when Thompson had first delivered his verdict that certain doors weren't meant for everyone. Sometimes, Becca had learned, the most important doors were the ones you built yourself after proving that the existing ones were inadequate for the people who truly deserved to walk through them. The sound of rotor blades filled the evening air as another group of pilots prepared for night training exercises, their aircraft properly maintained, their qualifications honestly earned, their opportunities distributed according to merit rather than bias. It was the sound of progress measured in the mechanical precision of helicopters whose pilots had been selected based on what they could do rather than assumptions about what they couldn't. And in that sound, Becca heard vindication not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been told they weren't ready for opportunities they had spent their lives preparing to deserve. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.